It definitely changed my thinking, and it definitely changed the way that I run my own life. I mean, after I took the justice course, I remember going home for Thanksgiving and sitting down at the table and just getting the whole family engaged in some terrible debate.
You get the theory, you get the learning behind it, you learn from all these great philosophers, but you're also able to apply it in class through discussion in the sections as well.
By the time you get done, you think that it's been one-on-one with you and Professor Sandel, you with the philosophers.
And I started to apply things to everyday life, and you start to annoy people and you go, aha, that's a very utilitarian argument, you know, because you can recognize these things now.
We began last time to consider the doctrine of utilitarianism, and we started with the version of utilitarianism put forth by its founder, the 18th century English political philosopher Jeremy Bentham. You'll remember that the main idea of utilitarianism is simply stated, and it's this: seek the greatest good for the greatest number. The highest principle of morality, whether personal morality or political morality, is to maximize the general welfare or the collective happiness, or in a phrase, to maximize utility. One aim of the Justice Course is to expose students to some of the great works in moral and political philosophy: Aristotle, John Locke, Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill. It's also to get students to reflect critically on their own moral and political convictions, to persuade them that these great books aren't just artifacts in the history of ideas, they're also episodes in arguments in which we're still engaged. What's Bentham's argument for this fundamental principle? The principle of maximizing utility? His answer is, what else is there? You say you believe in the idea of certain categorical duties or certain absolute human rights that should prevail regardless of the consequences? But how could you defend these duties or these rights, Bentham would argue, without assuming that respecting them would increase human happiness in the long run? Why else would you be concerned with them? So this is Bentham's argument for the principle of utility. Let me see if any of you have arguments against it. Yes?
Bentham just assumes that pleasure and good are necessarily the same thing. But what about pleasure derived from the pain of others? What if you have a group of, say, 100 sadists? Who would gain pleasure from inflicting pain on one individual?
Suppose there's a sadist who derives tremendous pleasure from inflicting awful things on other people. And it's true they suffer greatly, but not as much as he enjoys it. It's not so far-fetched, is it? Remember the Romans who would throw Christians to the lions in the Colosseum. And imagine how the calculus would go. It's true, it's excruciating pain for that Christian. But look at the collective ecstasy of the Romans. Yes.
It seems to me totally impractical, especially in a society as large as ours, where if people's idea of happiness are going to be so varied, you cannot define happiness. I couldn't define happiness.
Yes.
He quantifies rather than qualifies happiness and pain. Like for the Christian from Before the Lions, like there are a lot of Romans who have a great afternoon, but I'm sure the Christian has had, you know, a pretty horrible life, and it's a pretty horrible death, and his family suffers a lot. And I mean, you really can't put things on a scale like that.
This person echoes the worry that's emerged a couple of times about the failure to allow for qualitative distinctions between different sorts of pleasures rather than just quantitative ones. One objection, the first objection that has come out in this discussion, is that utilitarianism wrongly assumes a single uniform measure of value. The idea that all values, all goods, all forms of happiness can be cashed in a single coin, can be captured by a single currency of value or a single measure. A related objection is that even apart from the problem of measuring, utilitarianism doesn't enable us to make qualitative distinctions, only quantitative ones. And finally, there's the objection that utilitarianism, because it's concerned with collective happiness, with maximizing welfare for the society as a whole, fails to respect individual rights. Let's begin with the claim that not all values can be measured or captured in a single coin. There was in the 1930s a social psychologist who tried to prove what utilitarianism assumes, that it is possible to measure on a single scale pleasure and pain, happiness and suffering, possible to develop a science, a quantifiable science of utility. His name was Edward Thorndike, and he undertook a survey. This was in 1937, still in the midst of the Depression. He asked young recipients of relief, how much would you have to be paid to suffer the following experience? And he gave them a list. Some of the things on the list were these. How much would you have to be paid to have one upper front tooth pulled out? How much would you have to be paid to have one little toe cut off a foot? How much would you have to be paid to live the rest of your life on a farm in Kansas? Or to eat a live earthworm 6 inches long? Or to choke a stray cat to death with your bare hands? Well, which of these things do you think was the most expensive? We have, just a minute, we have the tooth, the toe, Kansas, the worm, and the cat. Which was the most expensive, do you think? Kansas? You're right. $300,000 for Kansas. Which do you think was the least expensive? Not the cat, not the worm, the tooth. For $4,500, you could have the tooth. Here was Thorndike's conclusion. He tried to prove, what many of you have denied, that there is a single uniform measure of value and that utilitarianism isn't wrong for thinking that there is. But the very implausibility of these comparisons, the fact that they are as ludicrous and as amusing as they are, suggests the absurdity of the project and seems to argue precisely for the opposite conclusion, that it's straining credulity to think that there is a single measure that can capture all goods and all values. Well, if you're not convinced by the failure of Thorndike's study, one other story. About 10 years ago, when I was a graduate student at Oxford in England, they had separate men's colleges and women's colleges. They weren't yet mixed. And the women's colleges had rules against overnight male guests. These rules were rarely enforced and easily violated, or so I was told. By the late 1970s, though, pressure grew to relax these rules, and this became the subject of debate among the faculty at St. Anne's College, which was one of these all-women's colleges. The older women on the faculty were defenders of the old order. They were opposed to change on conventional moral grounds. But times had changed, and they were embarrassed to give their true reasons for their objection, and so they translated their argument into utilitarian terms. If men stay overnight, they argued, the cost to the college will increase. How, you might wonder? Well, they argued, they'll want to take baths, and that'll use up hot water. Furthermore, they said, we'll have to replace the mattresses more often. The reformers, this is a true story, the reformers met those arguments by adopting the following compromise. Each woman could have a maximum of 3 male overnight guests a week. They didn't say whether it had to be the same one or a different one, provided that the guest paid 50 pence a night to defray the costs to the college. The next day, the headlines in the national newspaper read, St. Anne's girls, 50 pence a night. A week later, the parietal rules were waived altogether, and so was the fee. The moral of the story is that the language of virtue didn't translate very well into the language of utility, and the results to the college were neither virtuous nor very useful. The case of the one way of bringing out what's at stake in abstract philosophical texts is by trying to engage students in debate on concrete contemporary issues like military conscription, surrogate motherhood, affirmative action, whether to teach creationism or evolution in the public schools. Once students take a stand, it's possible to bring out the theoretical issues underlying the positions they take. In contemporary debate, Christian fundamentalists and the moral majority have challenged the liberal assumption that government can be neutral or should be neutral on questions of the good life. They say government can't be neutral. Under the guise of neutrality, say the Christian fundamentalists, the state imposes on our school children theories at odds with our religious convictions. The theory of evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution, for example. In Louisiana, a few years ago, the legislature passed a law requiring equal time for creationism and for evolutionary theories. The law said, if you teach evolution in the public schools, you've got to give equal time to the biblical account of creation. Well, let's look at that argument. In order to look at it, let's go back to the Scopes trial. That involved a Tennessee law back in the 1920s that was slightly different from the Louisiana law. The Tennessee law banned the teaching of Darwin in the public schools. John Scopes was brought to trial, prosecuted. He was a school teacher, prosecuted for teaching Darwin's theory of evolution in the public schools in Tennessee. We have here today an excerpt from the film Inherit the Wind, which depicts the courtroom drama, the debate between Clarence Darrow, arguing against the law, and William Jennings Bryan, arguing for the law. What was the argument of Clarence Darrow against the law in Tennessee that banned the teaching of Darwin in the public schools?
I'd like to call Dr. Amos Keller, the head of the Department of Zoology at the University of Chicago.
Objection?
On what grounds?
I wish to inquire what possible relevance the testimony of a zoology professor can have in his trial.
If Bertram Cates were on trial for murder, would it be irrelevant to call in witnesses to examine the weapon? Would it rule out testimony that the so-called murder weapon was incapable of firing a bullet?
I hold that the very law we are here to enforce excludes such testimony. The people of this state have made it very clear that they do not want this zoological hogwash slobbing around the schoolrooms.
Colonel Drummond, the bench rules that zoology is irrelevant to the case.
Can't you understand that if you take a law like evolution and you make it a crime to teach it in the public schools, tomorrow you can make it a crime to teach it in the private schools, and tomorrow you may make it a crime to read about it, and soon you may ban books and newspapers. And then you may turn Catholic against Protestant, and Protestant against Protestant, and try to foist your own religion upon the mind of man. If you can do one, you can do the other, because fanaticism and ignorance is forever busy and needs feeding.
Whose side were you on? How many thought that Clarence Darrow had a good argument? What was his argument against the law in Tennessee that banned the teaching of Darwin? What was his case against it? Yes?
That if you start restricting one small thing, you get a domino effect of then you start restricting other things, and pretty soon you're back burning people at the stake.
What do you say?
He objected to imposing morality.
He objected to imposing a specific morality on people, especially on school children. Is there anyone who disagrees with that argument?
The same argument could be made on the other side. And this is a particular issue where you really have to examine both the religious aspect and the evolution of the theory itself. And the way it's taught today, it runs counter not just to Christian fundamentalism, but so many theistic religions that by teaching it, that itself is imposing a specific morality. In many high schools across the country, a biological science course is required, and so students have no choice but to learn this particular theory, which does run counter to many theistic notions. And it's from those theistic notions that their entire worldview is developed. So this one theory in biology counters or destroys their entire basis for worldview.
Teaching that pi is not equal to 3 imposes on people's morality. It says in the Bible that there was a round pool with diameter of 10 cubits and a circumference of 30. And there was, in certain southern states at one time, a law saying that pi was equal to 3. This doesn't make it any more true or doesn't give it any reason to be taught in a school.
Everybody take that.
Many people think that it's inconsistent to have to believe in evolution and to believe in God. And if their entire system of morality stems from belief in God, then you're undercutting their entire belief system. Whereas in that particular case, it's just one element of one religion.
Evolution does not teach a moral system. It teaches the accepted theory, accepted by the scientific community worldwide. Furthermore, if you're going to make it required to teach creation, as taught by the Bible, then you are imposing a particular religious belief system. And you can't teach just the Judeo-Christian system. You'll have to teach the creation theories offered by every major world religion.
So your reply is science is science. To teach something that's been scientifically established, like Darwin's theory of evolution, isn't to impose a religion, as Chet claims. It's simply to teach the truth.
I agree with that person over there, and I think that Chet should send his kids to Sunday school. I mean, that's the place to learn about religion. I mean, there are so many different religions that you have to accommodate. You can't do it all in public school, and that's where the separation of church and state comes in.
Chet, Tracy says you should send your kids to Sunday school. Go ahead, reply.
I mean, in elementary school, you can opt out of the units on sex education. They should have that same possibility for students in high school. It shouldn't be something that's required. I'm not saying it shouldn't be taught, just that it shouldn't be something that is required of all students.
Students should be exposed to what's accepted in the scientific world. They don't have to believe it as it's taught, but they should be exposed to it and know what's going on. I don't think they should have the option to opt out of learning about what's going on in the world and what's accepted scientifically.
I think we have to get away from the idea of what Chet is saying about just because it's required, it's being inflicted or imposed on people. I mean, if you really have religious beliefs of any religion, and you're being exposed to something that's an intellectual and not a religious or a visceral notion, then if you reject it, how much stronger is your religious belief?
Suppose Chet or somebody else said, well, that seems like a good idea. Maybe that's a reason for teaching both theories. Maybe that's a reason for upholding Louisiana's solution for equal time for creationism and evolution, because those who believe in science, if they're confronted with a religious worldview, a religious account of the origins of the universe, it will only strengthen their scientific fervor, their commitment to the Enlightenment.
I would agree with that if creationism weren't based only on the book of Genesis. There's no scientific, really, basis for that.
Yes.
Suppose you're a child who's brought up with true Christian beliefs, and all of a sudden your science teachers ask you to believe in the theory of evolution. Now, when you're that young, you're at a very impressionable age, and your teachers are always portrayed as people whom you should respect and believe. Now, isn't that going to create in children a rebellious attitude towards their own religion, seeing as how they're being forced by these people who have so many diplomas and degrees and a good amount of respect that are making them trying to believe something else?
Religion and science are two different things. The teaching of science, of a scientific fact accepted by the majority of the scientific community throughout the world, should have no bearing on the morality of the school children. The school children have a morality. If they want to come in and have it contested and leave out and have their faith strengthened, that's fine. If they want to come in, have it contested, have their faith shaken, that's fine too. That's morality. That's not science.
Notice, running through the arguments made by the majority of you were two ideas. One was the idea that what was wrong with the Tennessee law is that it imposed a particular morality, a particular religious conviction. The other argument says what was wrong with that law in Tennessee back in the 20s is that it imposed the wrong theory, the false theory. Consider how they fit, how uneasily these two arguments fit together. The first argument is an argument that the state should be neutral, that it shouldn't impose any particular moral or religious view, that it should let citizens choose their own moral and religious convictions for themselves or within their families. The other view is not a view that insists the state should be neutral. To the contrary, it's a view that says, teach true theories, don't teach false ones. These two different reasons go to the heart of a question and perhaps a dilemma within liberal political philosophy. And the dilemma is this. Does liberalism stand for the idea that government should be neutral on questions of the good life, on moral and religious questions? Or does it depend on a different idea? That the particular values that liberalism affirms, values like toleration and individual rights, that those particular values are the highest values, the best values, the values that are essential if human beings or citizens in a democracy are to realize the good life. Is the moral majority wrong because they want to impose a vision, and it's wrong to impose a vision on the country? Or is the moral majority wrong because they want to impose the wrong vision, whereas liberalism would impose a different vision? That's one of the great questions of distributive justice is the issue of individual merit or moral desert. For example, do baseball players deserve to earn more than coal miners, or for that matter, professors? What makes me more deserving than someone else of this or that opportunity or reward? Of all the issues we discuss, this is the one that seems to stir the deepest feelings among undergraduates. Today to the case of affirmative action, or what's sometimes called preferential treatment. A question for distributive justice: how should jobs and opportunities, seats in colleges and universities be allocated? According to what principles? Is affirmative action just? Is it just to take into account such things as race or economic background? A few years ago, the city of New York held an exam to determine who would be promoted to police sergeant. Only 1.6% of the black officers who took the exam passed, only 4.4% of Hispanic officers, whereas 10.6% of white officers who took the exam received passing grades. As a result of this disparity, the city of New York said, this is unacceptable. And they decided to fill the positions of police sergeant according to a quota system in order to ensure a balance across racial and ethnic lines. What do you think?
In a lot of instances, it would be a real advantage for the police sergeant to understand at least a little bit about the people that he's dealing with, that he or she is dealing with. And it seems to me that that might be more important when you're trying to distribute justice than perhaps if someone could pass a written exam.
You have a reply?
What good is a racially diverse police force if it cannot perform the job it was assigned to do?
First of all, I think that you introduced probably what is the most controversial aspect of affirmative action.
Well, that's the purpose of this course. Controversy.
And that is the matter of standardized testing. But Harvard does not judge the students it takes on the basis of a standardized test alone. That is only one of the judgments it uses. There is absolutely nothing that proves that the police officers who made better on the test would make better police officers.
Harvard doesn't use test scores alone. Why should the New York City Police Department? A number of people have brought up the example of admission to Harvard College. So let's shift the example to Harvard's admissions policy. How many think it's all right, it's just, for Harvard to consider race as a factor in admissions? And how many think it's unjust? Let me just summarize the argument that Harvard College made, the way it defended its admissions program, and see whether you think it's a good argument or not. When reviewing a large group of candidates able to do well, race may count as a plus, just as coming from Iowa may count, or being a good middle linebacker. A farm boy from Idaho can bring something to Harvard College that a Bostonian cannot offer. Similarly, that you find implausible. Similarly, a black student can usually bring something a white student cannot offer. The quality of the educational experience of all students in Harvard College depends in part on these differences in the background and outlook that students bring with them. Harvard's argument was an argument in the name of the common good to the student body generally, and to its educational mission more generally. I want to hear from people who disagree with that, who think that policy is unjust.
when you decide to take someone, in the example of New York City, who is not qualified, who has not passed the test, solely on the basis of the fact that they are of a certain minority, that diminishes the meaning of affirmative action, I believe.
So you favor affirmative action only among those who are qualified by the baseline?
I would feel much more confident in myself being able to look across this room of people and say, over the multitude of faces that I see, and sexes, well, there are only two, but...
Even the Harvard program of diversity can't help that.
That every person in this room has gotten here, and there is one thing in common, that they have a good mind and a good intellect.
Does anyone else want to attempt to reply to that question?
I find the brief you read by Harvard highly offensive, because I think that it's a method of trying to back away from the real reason for affirmative action. I think the real reason for affirmative action is a compensatory measure there. And Harvard doesn't want to say, there is racism in the world, so they say common good.
Most people say that affirmative action is only good if you have two qualified people and then you use race. You have to ask, how do you get qualified? I mean, if you've been discriminated against historically, I mean, this goes for women and blacks and Jews and whatever, you're not even going to be able to get that higher test score to say, okay, now we favor race, because you've been discriminated against the whole time.
Notice one thing about these different arguments for affirmative action. Think back to the distinction we considered last time between moral desert as the basis for distributive justice and entitlements to legitimate expectation. Harvard's argument denies the claim that seats in Harvard College are a matter of desert. The assumption is this: none of you has a right that Harvard College define its mission and design its admissions policy in a way that prizes the qualities that you happen to have in abundance. It's true, once Harvard College defines its mission and designs its admission standards, you have a legitimate expectation to admission insofar as you meet these standards better than other applicants. But it's a mistake to think that you have a right to be considered according to any particular set of criteria, like straight, pure academic criteria, in the first place, because that wrongly assumes that admission to Harvard College is a matter of moral desert or intrinsic merit or virtue. Some of you still have lingering objections to this view. Is it possible to do away with the idea of moral desert in a theory of distributive justice? If you accept that no one deserves to be admitted to Harvard College, then isn't this the letter that Harvard College would have to write? First, to the unsuccessful applicants. We regret to inform you that your application for admission has been rejected. Please understand that we intend no offense by our decision. It's not your fault that when you came along, society happened not to need the qualities you had to offer. Those admitted instead of you were not themselves deserving of a place, nor worthy of praise for the factors that led to their admission. We are in any case only using them and you as instruments of the common good. What was the letter you actually got when you were accepted? Perhaps it should have read something like this. We are pleased to inform you that your application for admission has been accepted. Through no doing of your own, it turns out that you happen to have the traits that society needs at the moment. So we propose to exploit your assets for society's advantage.
You can't really just leave the justice course like you leave any other course and go on with your life, because it affects your way of thinking so completely.
We debated the issues over lunch. I debated at crew practice with my friends, because these aren't issues that have single answers. These are issues that have been debated since the time of Aristotle and Plato.
It gives one faith that somehow these tiny little ideas that you've been harboring for so long actually mean something really significant.